Imagine with me for a moment that all of these seats are filled with students. A great diversity of students. Students with different backgrounds and cultures and races. Students with different hobbies and interests. Students with different tastes in food and art. And isn't that a great thing, that diversity? Isn't that what gives the university its richness, that unity in diversity? Well, if that's the case, then shouldn't we also affirm the plurality of beliefs that would be represented in this room? Now, to the contrary, Jesus makes the radical claim, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. Isn't that an exclusive claim? Isn't that an arrogant claim to claim that you are right and everyone else is wrong? Wouldn't it be more generous to claim that the whole plurality of beliefs are equally valid, that we may be taking different routes to the top of the mountain, but ultimately we're all headed to the same place? This is the challenging subject that we're going to be dealing with in this session. And we're also going to ask this question: what would it look like to treat all of the faces in this room and all of the differing beliefs that they represent, many of which we would disagree with both love and truth? That is a question that our culture is desperately in need of an answer for. And I hope that this session will allow you to be part of that answer. Ravi, it's great to be back together for week 3. Really enjoyed our time together so far. And this week we're going to be talking about pluralism. And we talk about that in this content as the idea that all views are equally valid. That while there might be some superficial differences between different ways of seeing the world, maybe actually fundamentally they're all pretty much the same. And I always go back to an interaction I had with a student on a college campus at Portland State University. And he said to me, I think there's a universal human longing for peace. And he said, and I think that points to a fulfillment of that longing the way that hunger points to the reality of food. So I was following him to this point. And then he said, so therefore I think it's good to believe in something, whatever that is. And so he had this assumption that as long as you believed in some sort of big picture view of the world, that would meet this need of a universal human longing for peace more or less equally well. Now, I think there's some problems with this idea of pluralism, that all views are equally valid. For starters, does that include the view that all views are not equally valid? So you start to run into that logical incoherence pretty quickly. One of our colleagues, Abdu, I don't know if you remember this, but he had an interaction with a student at an open forum, and the student said, I don't think it's my place to disagree with anyone. And Abdu said, sure you do. And he said, no, I don't. And Abdu said, you just did. So quite quickly, this view does run into some philosophical problems, and yet it's really prevalent and it seems to be increasing in our society. So that's the question I first wanted to discuss. Why do you think this is such a prevalent view when actually there are some deep philosophical problems?
You know, this is very much a Western fashion statement on truth. It is fascinating while the West is moving towards a pluralization model and the pluralization of cultures and so on. A nation like India is moving farther back towards Hinduism and wanting it to be called Hindustan, this is the land of the Hindus. The Islamic world is moving back farther towards the past of Islam and so on. The Buddhist world, even China is moving more back towards the teachings of Confucius and so forth. We in the West, living under the illusion of neutrality, talk about, you know, it's wonderful to have all these pluralistic views, but you notice in the process what they actually do is they assault Christianity at the same time, because the Christian worldview does claim the nature of truth as exclusive. And the fact of the matter is, so do Muslims, so do Hindus. But the Christians take the hit for all of this. The fact of the matter is, Vince, you know, pluralism is a good thing in cuisines, in cultures, in languages. I try to remember who it was who used to talk about in the 70s that where else but in Los Angeles can you see a Korean fast food outlet where he is selling kosher tacos, and that's a wonderful illustration of pluralism in cuisine. You can see pluralism in languages. Our team that we work with, from 70 speakers with different languages. I love the accents. I love hearing the various languages. Living in India, I love going back to Hindi whenever I can. After having left so many years ago, it's nice to pick up. But pluralism in languages, pluralism in cuisine, pluralism in accents is one thing. Pluralism in reasoning is another thing. You're on a collision course. For example, if I say to you that the traffic light is red and I believed I had to stop, but another person coming in the other direction, I thought it was Christmas and therefore you celebrate, and so you can go through. You're going to have an accident sooner or later. It is because reasoning is built upon the fundamental laws of logic, and the laws of logic ultimately underlie reality, and two mutually exclusive statements both cannot be true at the same time and in the same sense. If you deny the law of non-contradiction, that contradictory statements can't both be true without qualifying one of them, you are going to run into the headwinds of stormy conditions where illogic and irrationality reign. What would happen if a pilot is 10,000 feet and he says, I'm a postmodernist. I really don't believe in all these measurements. I'm going to believe in what I want to believe. I'm going to act as if I'm at 30,000 feet and not at 10,000. Well, if he comes down 10,000 below, he's finished after losing that ground. You have to have a point of reference for absolute thinking, and the laws of logic apply to reality. The law of rational inference, the law of non-contradiction, the law of identity, all of these are part of the laws of logic. You assume identity when you're using language, you assume rational inference when you make a statement, you assume that two mutually exclusive statements can't be true. So pluralism in aesthetics, in taste, in foods, wonderful. Pluralism in logic ultimately leads to a chaotic, accident-oriented world. And that's what we are living in the West right now.
That's really helpful distinction. And here's one angle on part of what I think is going on. You can tell me if you think this is part of it. I think we're afraid of truth. Interesting, after we worked on the content for this resource, The Economist then came out and said we're living in a post-truth society. Oxford English Dictionary came and made post-truth their word of the year. And I think part of what's going on is we're afraid of truth because truth leads to disagreement, and we don't know how to disagree anymore. So disagreement leads to the devaluing of the person you disagree. From truth to disagreement to devaluing, and then to intolerance, to extremism, to violence, to terrorism. I think a lot of people have come to see that as the trajectory of truth. And so if truth is starting you down a path that ultimately is going to end in extremism, violence, and terrorism, well then maybe even if there are these philosophical incoherencies, then maybe we need to just go post-truth. Maybe we just need to affirm anything and everything that anyone believes if it's going to help us avoid that violence. And so truth becomes seen as this act of war, and then as an act of war, you only have two options. Either you fight or you flee. And I think that's partly what we're seeing in our culture. Either you just flee from truth to a pluralism, or you fight for truth, and you lose all civility, and you just use anger and violence to try to get your point across. One of the things I love about the Christian faith is that it refuses this cultural ultimatum. Jesus disagreed with us. His very coming was an act of disagreement with us, an act of saying that our lives had disagreed so badly with what he intended for them that we required saving. But that did not lead to the devaluing of us, to exactly the opposite. At the cross, we see God's greatest disagreement with us, and at the very same moment, we see God's greatest love for us. And so in the Christian God, you have God is love, and you have a God who is truth. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. And so if God is love, and if God is truth, then love is truth. Love without truth is not love. Truth without love is not truth. And so in Christianity, the two are always held together. I think that puts us in a position to be able to pray and speak prophetically into this culture. What could it look like for our disagreement with others to be expressed in our very act of sacrificial love for them, the way that God's disagreement with us was expressed through his very act of sacrifice for us. I don't think there's an easy answer to that question, but I think Christianity and the union of love and truth allows us to speak into this post-truth society in a way that no other worldview can.
You know, I well remember in the 90s, I think it was, I was speaking to the judiciary in one of our neighboring states. And I could just see that many of them were very skeptical about a Christian thinker coming to speak to them. There was a lackadaisical attitude about it. So I began with an illustration to them. I said, you are all peddlers in words. You deal with words. I said, as speakers, we deal with words. I said, I just heard the news before coming here. And they were debating the question. It was a famous line at that time, without going into the details, where a famous citizen in America made the statement, it all depends on what is means, you know. And so a leading television station sent the roving cameraman to interview people. Do words have meaning that are objective, or does a person reserve the right to fuse the word with any meaning they choose? And the answer was, well, ultimately, the person reserves the right to fuse the meaning to the words. Then they asked a second question. Does morality have absolutes, or do we have the right to choose our own morality? And the predominant answer was, we have the right to choose our own morality. So answer to the first question, words do not have ontic reference, no objective meaning. We give it the meaning. Morality has no point of reference. We give the point of reference. The third item on the news, ironically, was we had just informed Saddam Hussein that if he did stop playing his word games, we were going to start bombing him. And you know, all of a sudden the members of the judiciary are just sort of sitting up to take note and start listening. Words do have meaning outside of the ones we choose to give to it. Morality does have a point of reference. So pluralism that uses an escape mode to get away from absolutes and points of reference is a dangerous scheme. Right now we are living through it. A man brings another man to the front, hoods his face, takes a knife and chops the head off like that in front of cameras for millions to watch on the news at night. What is he saying? My values tell me this is what I should be doing. This is the way I eliminate pluralism in the world, unless you follow my view. Yep. Should we be aghast? Should we say this is morally reprehensible? The West is flirting with total chaos unless language returns to meaning and moral values return to absolutes.
That example brings this next question to the surface really poignantly. Sometimes I think people move towards a pluralism because they have this misconception that different ways of seeing the world, whether secular philosophies or religious worldviews, may be superficially different, but they're fundamentally the same. I know this is something you've given a lot of thought to. How would you respond to the person who thinks that?
I respond with one line and then an explanation. We assume that all religions are fundamentally the same and only superficially different. It is the reverse that is true. They are fundamentally different, at best superficially similar. Hinduism does not believe the same thing Islam does. Islam does not believe the same thing Buddhism does. Buddhists do not believe the same thing the Christians do. And you go on right down the line. And so also with secularism, which is elevated to a point of religious worldview. We have fundamental differences and at best superficial similarities. The difference comes in many, many ways. And that is this. For example, if you ask a Hindu, what is non-negotiable in your faith? Is there anything you will not give up? Every Hindu I have talked to will not give up two things. He will not give up the law of karma, that every birth is a rebirth and each birth is the payment for the previous life. So he does not give up the law of karma, or he or she doesn't give that up, or they do not give up the notion of reincarnation. Every life is a rebirth and you go through the cycle of reincarnations. Those two form the core of Hindu belief. They may disagree on whether the Vedas are the authority or the Gita is the authority or whatever it is, but they will not give up those two. If you ask the Muslim, he will tell you, it is the creed that you have to hold to, and that Muhammad is the last and the greatest prophet, and Allah is the ultimate being, God himself. If you look at the Christian, he will say to you that God, through his son Jesus Christ, offered sacrifice for sins so that you and I may have redemption in him and the grace he offers of forgiveness and a communion with the living God. These are completely different worldviews, fundamentally different. The question is not whether they are different or not. The question is which of these is true, yes, and deals with the reality of truth. One more thing I wanted to add in terms of this post-truth culture. The post-truth culture really came about from the political arena, that truth to the politician means one thing to A and another thing to B. But it became a hardened extension of not just that what was true for this politician was not true for the other, but that any politician then could manipulate the facts to a point of even taking an untruth and speaking it as a truth so that they can have the greater end of ultimate victory. That's really what matters. That's the dangerous side of this post-truth era. It's not that they say each one has subjective reasoning. What they're really saying is your subjectivity can lead you to manipulate facts to an end of being in control, because then the whole world is under your purview and you control what ultimate reality is all about. Post-truth is really the post-mortem of a postmodern culture. We came to the realization that we don't even believe in truth. Postmodernism says no truth, no meaning, no certainty. That's why our young people today, with the highest rate of suicides, even at middle school, because they have no meaning and they have no certainty, because they lost truth along the way of why we are actually here.
And if we've lost truth, then you can just make claims and you don't have to back those claims up with evidence, which is ironic for that to be the way that secular society is going, when that's so often the point against Christian faith unfairly, the idea that it's not based on evidence or reason, something that we've already spoken about in the previous weeks. One point that I heard in a political race recently, another example of being able to make claims and not having to back them up. When asked about God, the person said, well, we all believe in the golden rule, and that's what we call God. Jesus' golden rule, do to others as you would have them do to you. And this politician felt that they could just put out there that we all believe in that. That's what everyone believes, and that's what everyone has said. And actually, that's radically distinctive to Jesus Christ. You look through history, you look through philosophy, no one until Jesus ever said that. Confucius came closest. He said, do not inflict on others what you do not want inflicted on yourself. Well, that's the difference between not punching someone in the face and building your enemy a hospital. Radically distinctive to who Jesus is.
And one more thing to add to that, very importantly, what Jesus said was, if you listen to the other aspirants to divine status or prophetic status, they will talk about speaking the truth or telling the truth. Jesus is the only one who said, I am the truth.
Yes.
I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes unto the Father but by me. He said to Pilate, they that are on the side of truth, listen to me. He was the embodiment of what is true. What does that mean? In him you see what ultimate reality was intended to be, and why it was that sin needed grace and forgiveness, why it was that a sacrifice was needed on the cross, why it was that we ultimately break bread and drink of the cup, why is it that marriage is sacred, why is it the family is the fundamental unit of life, why is it that we are made in the image of God. All these realities are the outflow of He not just speaking the truth, but He being the truth. And to know Him, when you abide in my word, you are my disciples, then you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. You are free from the bondage of a lie. For the first time, you are at liberty to accept the truth, admit the truth, and live by the truth. The Christian faith is both unique and beautiful, simple and sublime. A child can understand what it means to receive Jesus into your life. And the greatest philosopher can say, the older I get, the more I find the plumb line of my thinking cannot fully comprehend the vastness and the majesty of who God is and how we may know him.
Wow, what a beautiful promise, and what a beautiful explanation of why we can be confident that Jesus is the right choice, even among the plurality of choices that we're living in. Someone once said there are two ways to choose a coat. You can inspect the coat for its dimensions and all of its measurements, or you can try the coat on. I think both are important. In my testimony, in my story, I probably wouldn't have tried the coat on until I had taken some of those measurements of science and philosophy and logic and seen that it was roughly in the right vicinity. But there's no substitute for that invitation that you spoke of, that invitation of trying the coat on, of clothing yourself in Christ, of testing the claims of a person who promises that they can bring love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. One of the people that we saw on a university campus recently give their life to Christ, he journeyed with us for a week. At the end of that week, his questions had been answered, his heart had been spoken to, he wanted to make that step of trust in Jesus, and he bowed his head and he prayed the beautiful prayer of a new believer, and when he was done, he opened his eyes, and these were the very first words out of his mouth after he had become a Christian. You'll remember, he said, I have always felt like I had to wear a mask, but now this is the first time in my life that I can take off that mask and I can be fully myself and fully alive. No pluralism of worldviews can do that. No ism, no theory can do that. I think Jesus is the only person who can do that.
I think that's so good to funnel it down to that. You know, it can all remain up here, and you don't realize how beautiful is the gospel message to transform a life and bring forgiveness and meaning. When people ask me, you know, after 45 years of traveling around the globe, what keeps me going? It is the truth and the beauty of the gospel and the visible difference it makes in the lives of people. So whenever anybody hears the gospel, if they want to mock it, they may be free to do so. But it's only when you put your trust in Christ and respond to his invitation that you understand what life really means and what living is all about. I am come that you might have life, said Jesus, and that you might have it more abundantly. That heart need and that mind response is what God takes and makes something beautiful for the purpose for which you were created.
That's our hope and our prayer for every person. Thank you for discussing this important topic. I look forward to the next one.
Thank you, Vince.